Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Eric Sullivan with the Sports Facilities Companies, and this is a segment of our SFC webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about concept to community impact, guiding cities through sports and entertainment projects. I am really looking forward to this topic today, something that we probably get as much, if not the most, questions about every day when we are helping communities across the country. So real quick before I introduce today's guest, just a quick overview of what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about the concept of concrete model and how we look at this from an overarching development standpoint. We'll share a little bit about the history and how we got to where we're at. We're certainly going to talk about public-private partnerships and some of the people, some of the tools that are out there as funding mechanisms for these types of projects. We'll share some applied case studies, and then we certainly want to hear from you, and we'll answer questions. Now, just a little bit about housekeeping for today. This session is being recorded, so we'll make sure if you want a copy of this recording, we'll send it out afterwards and make it digitally available. We'll also make sure that as we answer your questions, we'll do that through the chat. So there's a Q&A chat, and as we go through this session live, feel free to put your question in there, and at the end, we'll circle back and answer as many as we can. And last but not least, if you happen to have any technical issues along the way, also feel free to put that in the chat, and our technical support team will make sure that we get you back up and running just as quickly as possible. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Ken Hira. Ken is longtime friend and industry partner with Kosmont Companies. Ken, share with the group a little bit about your background and what Kosmont does.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eric. Very excited to be on today and discuss, I think, a quite relevant topic and what's happening in the marketplace. Ken Hira, president of Kosmont Companies. Kosmont has been in business. We're in our 40th year of business. We're all things to economic development, real estate, public finance. We work very closely with a lot of municipalities. We're based here in Southern California, but we're up and down the state. We're covering the Western United States for that matter, have seen a lot. And we want to share with you today some of the insights, some of our experience on sort of economic trends, economic development tools. We also have some case studies. But at our company, we work closely with the public sector, lots of city and county clients for that matter. And again, like I say, we work throughout the Western United States. We also work with developers. So we know that both parties need to be in the room, and we'll talk more about that when we get there. The public and private sectors really need to come together to understand the dynamics of land use and some of the trends today. And I think the sports facilities companies is a great partner for us and for you all in our audience. We really look forward to sharing. Thank you.
Now, as we think about these projects, community-based projects of all shapes and sizes that have sports and entertainment type uses, this is a model that we call concept to concrete. It's an oversimplified version of all the steps that it takes to bring a project literally from concept or ideation, from vision, all the way to community impact. And if we start at the left side of this chart, what we're looking at are things around market research, feasibility, and what we're going to spend the bulk of today's conversation in, project implementation. Now, I don't want to gloss over it. Once we get through project implementation, there will be time for design, for construction, for pre-opening, all things that are absolutely important to the process, and we'll certainly cover in other webinars in this series. But today we're going to talk about project implementation, and why I think that's so exciting, why I'm so happy to have Ken here with me is this is really when projects become real. There are no shortages of great market opportunities, of visionaries, of community leaders who want to see something happen. When I say see something happen, a development of this type or a reuse of some sort in their community. And a lot of times when we're thinking about that, there is a real estate consideration and making sure that we've got the right zoning and entitlements. Certainly, we have to capitalize this project. We're going to talk a lot about that today and some different tools out there from both the public perspective and from the private sector. We'll talk about public incentives and how there are different tools in the toolbox to help make these projects come to life. And then certainly, how do we go through this process and with a multitude of partners and stakeholders at the table, how do we bring these to life? And I'll just say that when we think about stakeholders, the way that we typically define that is anyone who has a vested interest in the upfront capitalization and development of the project or the ongoing success. So we'll talk more about that, but these can be capital groups, they can be local community partners, they could be hospitals, schools, all sorts of different user groups. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about these types of developments, at their core, they're real estate developments. And so I shared we'd talk a little bit, how do we get here? Ken, can you talk to us a little about land use and the revolution as you shared that we're seeing right now?
Sure. What we've seen in our experience of late is the land uses, the asset classes have really been evolving significantly. And I'll talk a little bit more about retail specifically, but the reality of it is retail has always changed over time. It's been changing from the minute that it came online, pardon the pun. But as retail has evolved, it's also created changes amongst other asset classes. What does retail and industrial now have in common? They have a lot in common today because of that online shopping. The days of old department stores and old malls have really changed. There's an obsolescence there in the way people shop, the way people, frankly, the way they communicate, the way they commute because of technology. So technology has a lot to do with the reason why land uses have really gone through major changes. But retail has kind of been the leader of how things have changed. Well, if we're shopping more online, industrial becomes in greater demand. And the reality of retail and industrial for distribution purposes, e-commerce, last mile delivery for that matter, is retail and industrial, I think of as almost kissing cousins these days. Right. And I wish there was a way to have people raise their hands, Eric. But if I could get a raise of hands, here we go, right? On a webinar, it's not live. Raise your hand if you're not happy when your package doesn't come to your front door of something that you bought within 2 days. You kind of go, gosh, I wish it could be here quicker. And then raise your hand if that package doesn't show up to your front porch in one day. And then now we've gotten to the point where we're so um, immediate gratification, and thanks to Amazon, we're not happy if maybe things don't come the same day. There are almost 200 million Amazon Prime members today in our country. 200 million. And that means that that's more than half, if you will, of our population who have jumped onto this online concept. Okay, what does that mean for retail? Well, retail may have declined from the perspective of those commodities that come to our porches, but retail wants to now be part of an experience. The
Mhm.
consumer is really looking for an experience. And frankly, it ties right into sports and entertainment and restaurants and food and beverage and places. It's about places today and placemaking, quite frankly. What else does that mean for our other asset classes? Housing is in great demand. And what's going to happen with housing is housing, which we have a massive shortage of, is going to become part of a blend of uses. And as housing blends on sites where we have too much retail, you now have a different synergy. You have a blend of uses. I won't spend too much time on the office asset class, but the reality of it is the pandemic had a lot to do with us doing work from home. I have a whole analysis on the impact of how residential today is actually a version of economic development. And I don't have time to get into the quantitative side of that, but under the roof of a home, we used to just sleep and now we shop and sleep. We used to just sleep and now we shop, work, and sleep. So we do a lot of things underneath the roof of our home, which ends up putting residential as part of a really, in our world, an economic development growth driver. You can go to the next slide. Let me talk about how retail has evolved, as I alluded to before. If you follow the arrows, we started off with these downtowns and these districts, and we're actually kind of coming full circle. But there was
Mhm.
a lot of essentials to downtown. Then we've got the enclosed mall that came on the scene in the 1940s, if you will. Following that, the malls just got bigger and bigger and bigger, 2 stories, 3 stories, mega malls, million square foot malls, and plus, plus, plus. And that was an indoor regional concept. But then you look at the power center, which are mainly outdoor asset classes, and there's nothing that exciting about a power center. It was selling commodities. Well, a lot of that shifted to online. If you look at the circle that ends up calling it, it's called lifestyle center. It's hard to see, but you'll see some a little fountain there. It's more activation and more activity where the consumer gets to enjoy something which we've called a lifestyle center in the last 10, 20 years. And today, if you go to the bottom left, that's the focus is we are in an experiential blended land use mode of those asset classes where they come together. You can't see that picture very well, but it's a center that has residential, retail, entertainment, and if you can see the green space, I want to highlight this. The green space is the anchor tenant. Open space is today's anchor tenant. Public space is today's anchor tenant. And quite frankly, the sports world can have a lot to do with that by activating these quote unquote green spaces that can really drive something that's experiential. That's what the consumer wants. They want experience.
It's so interesting you say that, Ken. Well, a lot of that resonated with me, especially as I thought about all of the Amazon packages that arrive daily to our office, to our house, to our neighborhood. But a lot of those trends that you talked about in the consumer experience and the overall, changing of assets is really parallel to what we've seen in the evolution of a modern sports facility. We've had some other webinars where we've talked about program-driven design. We've talked about density differentiation, diversification of use, all these things. And if you look back to the early 2000s, what we saw was really the classic parks and recreation, multi-sport recreation facility. These are your ball fields where you'll have some rectangles, you'll have some diamonds, you'll have some indoor, maybe some aquatics or ice, but really, community focused rec centers. Then we had this whole explosion of sports tourism, right? The travel ball that we saw bigger, better, newer, nicer venues start to come online. And what was interesting about that was it was really early adopted by the tourism markets. How do we round out the shoulder months of our tourism cycles? Because we already have the infrastructure of hotels, of restaurants, of retail opportunities. But then, Ken, as you were talking about some of the changes in retail, that really made me think about how we're seeing, and you mentioned it's almost coming full circle with urbanization and downtown revitalization. And then as we think about these experiential life cycles, live, work, play certainly isn't dead. It's just changed in how we consume those different things. And now fast forward to where we're at today and where the retail, the hospitality, and the sports sectors have all come together. And that's these, as we call mixed use developments. And that's where you'll see a sports based anchored tenant that could be on the stadium or the arena side. It could be on the sports tourism side. But what it's essentially doing is it's concentrating traffic to a specific space that is then creating these great guest experiences. And I call them mixed use developments. Ken, I think you got a little different term.
Yeah, well, I call it blended use because I was tired of, some of the old mixed use formats is just put residential above retail, and the retail on the bottom floor does what? A lot of times it sits vacant because it's got to be integrated more properly and more interestingly. Horizontal mixed use, a multiple set of uses. I kind of think of it as more integrated. That's where I kind of use the term blend. You mentioned hospitality, entertainment, residential, in the good old days, office and retail. They blend and integrate. And if they don't, then we're kind of missing the point because we used to have these subdivisions and malls and business parks. They're kind of coming together now in a different ecosystem.
That makes a lot of sense. And, a term that gets tossed around a lot right now are P3s or public-private partnerships. And when I talk about these projects getting, bigger, better, newer, nicer, and when you saw some of those images that Ken pointed to about green space and activation, and we talk about the experience economy, as those projects have gotten more integrated, they've also gotten more complex. And I would say a common denominator, whether we're talking about urban redevelopment or we're talking about, suburban sprawl or we're talking about tourism density, they're pretty intensive land uses. And so one of the things that's really evolved over the last, 10 years are these public-private partnerships. And I would say if you looked back in the rearview mirror, early 2000s, we really saw a lot more of public projects and private projects. Fast forward to where we are today, almost everything is a P3 in some way, shape, or form because there's so many efficiencies to gain. It just makes a lot of sense. So what is a P3? In its most simplest term, a P3 is really just a delivery model. And what I mean by that, it's the public sector and it's the private sector working together to figure out where are their efficiencies and helping to capitalize and develop these bigger, better destinations. So on the public side, there's a lot of different ways that we can look at that. Land, we can go right there to land. We'll talk about some of those different large tract land possibilities. There are economic tools that Ken is going to get into some details and specifics around here in a moment. There is support from tourism, from parks and recreation, from other municipal programs, public works that can be hugely impactful to how these projects come together and serving multiple goods within the community. On the private sector side, one of the things we talk about a lot with our private sector clients is when we come into a municipality, um, it doesn't have to be a full-on partnership that we're turning the project over. But if we can get green tape instead of red tape or political will, as we cover, man, the process gets a whole lot easier, and some of those bigger hurdles become a little bit more easily overcome as they pop up inevitably throughout the development process. But from the private sector side, and Ken, I know you're going to talk a little bit more about this, but another thing that's really interesting is oftentimes this is a way to leverage lower cost of capital with some of the different economic program tools that are out there versus just raising this with traditional private debt and equity. Ken, anything you would layer in from a P3 or just a foundational standpoint of your perspective?
Sure, and I appreciated a comment you just made, Eric, and we didn't practice this to the 130 people on. There's so many versions of P3. I mean, in our world, working at Kosmont and advising cities and working on public-private transactions, almost everything is a quote unquote P3 deal. What's meant by that? The public and private sectors are involved. Just to get an entitlement or to get a permit or to execute on a creative blend of uses or a project that might be complicated or not, both public and private sectors need to be in the room. And I think we all know that. That's stating the obvious, but the reality of it is, and I've been saying this, I don't want to repeat myself on things I've been saying kind of out of the pandemic, quite frankly, is as the land use revolution kind of kicked into gear post pandemic, right? The office market changed, the retail market clearly changed. We have a housing shortage, industrial, et cetera, hospitality. I can talk more about that. The zoning and the zoning codes of many cities really needed to be revisited. Like what is this property zoned if it's not going to be a traditional retail center and it's got a little
Mhm.
fulfillment to it? So I think that puts a burden on the municipalities and cities and counties to be more flexible. So it's flexibility, I think that becomes important. Specific plans that are too prescriptive and zoning codes that are extremely prescriptive without a lot of permitted uses, I think are things that need to be revisited. So it's the flexibility that becomes important on the part of cities in this world of P3. Okay. On the flip side, the development community, we have those clients. We know a lot of private sector folks. We know a lot of developers. We work with them. I'm a recovering developer myself. Um, if we're not collaborating, on the development side of the equation, if the developers don't understand the needs for communities, the needs for the public sector, the opportunities within the public sector to create these public-private partnerships, which are somewhat complicated, if they don't understand that and they just think these are hurdles or burdens, it's not going to work very well. So what developers and the private sector need to be is more collaborative, in my estimation. So flexibility on the part of the municipal public side, collaboration on the part of the private development side. And we're in major large scale public private deals at Cosmont as we speak. And I really find that those themes become critical to making successful P3 projects.
Yeah, man, there's so much we could unpack there. We've only got an hour, so I'm gonna resist the urge. But As you were talking there, Ken, what I was really thinking about, the word that kept resonating is efficiency. How can we create more efficient projects in terms of cost, delivery, time, use of land? And when we think about land, these are, as we said before, real estate intensive projects. If you just take, for example, a traditional indoor sports facility, and let's say you're in that 80 to 100,000 square foot range, we can easily be up to a 3 to 5 acre site when we're talking about setbacks, parking, easements, all those sorts of things. If you're talking about outdoor assets, a soccer field, almost 2 acres, full-size baseball field, 4 acres. When you start talking about larger sports tourism assets, that's a lot of land. So one of the places these P3s so often come together is to try to solve that real estate equation. So we'll talk about some examples both on the public side and on the private side. So right now in public spaces, and I'm gonna tee you up for a couple here, Ken. I'm gonna address a couple and tee you up for a couple. One thing we've seen are just underutilized parkland. So if we've got parks that have kind of run their course and gotten tired, if we have municipal golf courses that have been maybe surpassed by other course offerings in the market and they've been underutilized, there are opportunities to revitalize those and still keep them in the same zoning category of recreation use and in public use. And we've got examples of that in Bryan, Texas, with the Legends Sports Complex. We've got a number of examples with that across the country. Fairgrounds are another interesting public asset class where so many communities have a fairground, and oftentimes they're activated so few times a year, sometimes just one time for the fair annually. And it's great when they do it and they bring in the carnival and they've got the demolition derby and truck pulls and everything that's so excited, tractor pulls. But then what happens, right? Well, if we can use that and if we can leverage other events and if we can bring more concerts, entertainment, sports offerings, it can often be a real win-win. We're seeing more and more opportunities with colleges, universities. You mentioned post-pandemic. Post-pandemic, and with the changing in college athletics, NIL, there's not a community out there, a campus out there where they're not talking the athletics program about generating more revenue. And so now if you look at states like North Carolina and some of the programs they've got, they're actually encouraging P3s on state-owned university land to foster development, create those efficiencies, and deliver better projects. Ken, one that I wanted you to talk about because I know you do so much work in California. California is synonymous with expensive real estate. We've seen some really creative use of brownfields, floodplains, easements. Anything you want to touch upon there or creative uses that you've seen on the West Coast?
Oh, absolutely. And there is a case study that we have a slide on later, but I'll bring it up now. There was a 100 plus acre piece of property in the Inland Empire in the city of Norco. Years ago, we worked on this. The city controlled the land and it was deed restricted. So the commercial couldn't be built on it. So what do you do with it? We help them go to the marketplace, frankly, and find a developer who could activate that land. It remained relatively undeveloped, if you will, but for soccer and for equestrian, those were missing uses, missing opportunities within the marketplace. Norco being Horsetown, USA, a dearth of soccer fields, club soccer fields, etc., for youth sports. And we put together a deal where we found the developer. They activated and built out that 120-acre site, and we ended up doing a ground lease. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it was an asset to a city that was leverageable, if you will. That land came to fruition through ground rent, and the land was activated through a developer in with soccer and equestrian, and it was a huge success. And it's evolved a little bit today and kind of dealt with some things during the pandemic, but it's a really interesting case study when you talk about land and the value of land, particularly in the California market.
Absolutely. Now, on the private side, we also see a whole number of different types of opportunities. I mentioned the suburban sprawl before, where you've got density of rooftops. Density of rooftop, we're looking for things for family fun and entertainment. We're looking for after-school programs, recreation outlets, healthy things for families to do. often areas where we're seeing blended or mixed use developments come together and be developed in conjunction with sports and entertainment assets. Retail, as we talked about, is really interesting from the standpoint that, Ken, as you talked about that evolution of retail, and as we saw malls kind of change and evolve over time, we saw big box change and evolve over time, and this whole at-home consumerism, it's created some large scale opportunities. There's a couple of case studies I'm excited about that we're going to share with you when we get into those, where we're actually using vacant or underutilized retail area to activate those previously vibrant destinations within a community. And then last but not least, opportunity zones, districts as far as TIFs, TDTs, et cetera, those aren't necessarily private real estate exclusive properties, but what those are is they're real estate opportunities that fall within some of the jurisdiction of programs that exist to create capital opportunities for projects. We're going to talk about those in a moment, so I'm going to resist the urge to start explaining all the acronyms right now. But when we start to think about this, the Beltway corridors, large tract land, anywhere that we have expansive area that we're looking to bring density to, those are often the places that we're seeing programs available to lower the cost basis of that land. Now, in addition to land, I mentioned stakeholders before, and stakeholders being someone that had a vested interest in, the short-term startup or the long-term success of a project. Ken, do you want to talk about just some of the people that are typically at the table from your experience?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. As we kind of view the world of economic development with lots of our clients, city clients at Kosmont companies, it's important for the cities and municipalities to know who's at the table, so to speak, but what are their priorities? What's driving their priorities? What's driving their needs, if you will? And we see that as a trifecta. There's three legs to this stool. You have residents and the community. Very important, right? What's important to them is quality of life, cost of living, services, amenities, essentials, experiences. Are there good parks? Are there good sports facilities? Is there good experience? Do we feel safe in our community? What are all those opportunities? Investors, okay, what drives their just sort of decision making? Technology has something to do with how they view opportunities, shifting in demand, the regulatory environment. How easy is it to get things done? Do you have communities that are in entitlement processes that are business friendly, or are they challenges? And depending on what state you're in, you're going to probably answer that question differently. But there is a regulatory policy that the investors have to manage. In today's times, with capital markets, not being as robust, with higher cost of capital and higher construction, capital markets end up being a constraint, if you will. And I can come back to that. But then workforce patterns. City Hall. What's important to City Hall? Their community, their residents, the employer's needs, different funding strategies, state, federal, local, et cetera. And then can revenues fund public safety? Can revenues fund parks and sporting opportunities? Can those revenues sustain and fund services? And sustainability and the sort of economic climate and the resiliency that's really actually critical in today's economy is a whole separate set of topics. But quite frankly, sustainability and resiliency become also very important to city hall, or the county or the municipality that's involved.
Absolutely. That makes a ton of sense. And, one of the things that we often say to municipal leaders when we are working with them to take a project to market is when we put our private developer hats on, what we want to know when we come to a market is that we're welcome there, like you said, with political will and support for a project. But what's really appealing is, how as a private developer do I make my dollar go further, and how do we create better and more impactful community projects, because we can find those efficiencies and those supporters locally. And I like those three buckets because they're really clean. And now I'm gonna make it messy for a second. And I'm gonna talk in a lot of different directions. And one of the realities to concept to concrete when we're in this project implementation stage is that we are knocking on a lot of doors, we're kicking a lot of tires because we do want to make this a community driven project if it's truly going to be a P3 and it's going to be a win for all of those different groups. What's also interesting is it with different uses also brings revenue, brings startup capital, brings different tenant lease opportunities, brings different groups to the table. So just to pick on a few of these here that are in these different categories, and you look at something like the tourism bureaus. We've talked about sports tourism. This is now going on a $60 billion annual industry just here domestically. That is a massive, massive spend. And when we think about the amount of hotel room nights that are booked by travel sports, professional sports, and even just by recreational hobbies, it's just incredible. On the school front, we've seen a number of examples. We've got one, the Fort Bend Epicenter. One of our major tenants on an arena is the Fort Bend ISD, the Independent School District. They're supporting that project because they wanted to be able to graduate their kids in the county for the first time ever, and they didn't have a venue large enough to do that, and now they do. When we think about nonprofits and community foundations, oftentimes they're looking to be close to community and may not be able to, quote unquote, afford a home of their own. But if they can be part of a bigger, complex, part of a bigger development, a bigger campus, they can absolutely find opportunities to make these projects more efficient. The banks and credit unions were seen as not just banking partners, but also sponsors and naming rights. Retailers, as you heard Ken say, are looking for activation and they're looking for experiential. So all these different groups, what we start to do is we really categorize them to say, okay, are these going to be public or private sector partners? Are they going to be a community partner or a nonprofit partner? And then we'll get into some more of the institutional and funding. But what we start to do is we categorize how are we working with these groups, either on the programming side and delivering opportunities for recreation or entertainment engagement with the community? Are we working with them on the capital side and helping to bring, either community philanthropic dollars or larger institutional dollars to the table? And then certainly when we think about coming out of project implementation into design, one of the things that we always are talking about is program driven design, and that's making sure that the end users, the people that we're going to be partnered with and engage with for the long term, also realize what they need out of these developments. That might be office space, might be storage space, might be locker rooms, might just be home of, but those are the different types of things that we also are looking for. And at the end of the day, where we see the most of these projects struggle is on the multi-million dollar question: how do we pay for this? How do we capitalize these projects? And if you think about the roles of these different stakeholders in the project, ultimately a number of them do lead back to money. And I don't mean money just from the standpoint of these have to be for-profit developments. Even if they're nonprofit, without margin, there is no mission, right? Unless you just have an endless pool of money, a subsidy, an endowment coming in, we have to be able to balance budgets. So, Ken, do you want to take a moment and talk about some of those different tools and how that equates into opportunities for projects?
Sure. There's no silver bullet to the point about how do you pay for things, of course, Eric. And this is just a summary. This list is not comprehensive, if you will, but we try to break things down. And I will say that we are using all of these tools and all of these currencies. We think of the world as, all right, how can the tool then create the currency, and then how can the currency be leveraged? How can the currency or value be captured? So that's the equation for us in these public-private deals. And again, we're doing advisory work, we're doing at Kosmont, we're doing brokerage work, and we're doing public finance. So we're all stages of this. But let me go over categorically. You got sort of real estate asset strategies, you've got zoning, you've got districts, And then you've got some of these unique financing opportunities like grants and these public financing tools, and I'll get into that a little bit. On the real estate asset strategies, I talked about one example, which is when cities or counties control land. And that's an important asset. What can you get out of that land? How do you leverage that land? What is the currency from land? And in the form of a ground lease, we've been involved in several ground lease deals. Kosmont, you got the lease revenue that becomes a leverageable stream of income that can help pay for things. Parking districts, create the district, take the parking revenues, and either use it, pay as you go, or leverage it, et cetera. Site specific tax revenues, ticket taxes that can come from venues, major venues, sales tax that can come out of the different venues. TOT, which is transient occupancy tax, that's what it's called here, hotel tax, whatever it's called, creating the revenue stream or leveraging the revenue stream out of the currency that comes from hotels and the hospitality industry. I'm involved in a couple major hospitality projects as we speak, and the bright idea there is the fact that it throws off a lot of currency, and that's very leverageable by the municipalities and frankly by the private sector. Sales tax assessment. We've done some development agreement deals where there's a sales tax equivalent that the development and the project can pay. And you can think of those as sort of community benefit fees. The world of community benefits is very important. Let's go to zoning for a second. We talk about capturing value and density opportunity reserve or a density opportunity bank. Cities or municipalities can give density to land, or they can sell density to developers. Just think about that. You can give the density to land and you're kind of giving it away. If you sell it, hang on to it and sell it to a developer, it's worth something. And the way we've done those deals where we use density and have municipalities capture the value is you hang on to that density, you get that developer to say, yes, I need more density. I can pay for certain things. Well, what can you pay for? That's in the form of a community benefit. What do I need? I need my park upgraded. I need sports facilities. I need affordable housing. So there's a trade-off there. Specific plans, it's an approval process. It's in California, it's clearing the environmental hurdles. That's a version of currency. Districts. We're involved in a lot of districts, tax increment districts. They're called EIFDs in California, but it's basically levering the revenue of property tax, the currency of property tax. Community facilities district, which is a tax on land, a parcel tax, if you will. It is a new tax, but you can use that as a special tax currency. And then tourism improvement districts. So that's leveraging transient occupancy tax or hotel tax. I think of this also, Eric, as if the anchor in a project is a sports facility, if the anchor is that facility, what happens around it,
Mm.
right? If you take a mall site, it's 100 acres and you got a bunch of obsolescence, which I alluded to before, and you now anchor it with a sports facility that serves the community, that serves the demand that's missing. What happens around it? Residential, hotel, retail, etc. And that's how you can then take TOT, create the tourism districts, create the tax increment districts, take the property tax, take the hotel tax, and lever it up. Lastly, grants and public financing. What I like about grants is it's free money. It's OPM, it's other public money, it's other people's money. In California, there's Prop 4, which is a $10 billion source. And frankly, it's paying for resiliency. There's a lot of opportunity to go pay for climate, resiliency, sustainability. And then debt capital. You talked about it before, Eric. What I really like is the cost of money from the public sector is
Mm.
significantly lower than the cost for the private sector. And in today's market, let's use real numbers. If a municipality or a county or city can bring debt capital to a deal and it's at 4%, and the cost of the private capital is at 7 or 8% plus plus plus, there's a huge arbitrage that can bring value to a project. There's a lot of accretive, it's an accretive part of the capital stack that lease revenue bonds or even CFD bonds or even tax increment financing bonds can bring to the equation. No silver bullets. It's a whole stack of capital that I think have to get these deals done. But that's part of why we're in the business that we're in. Sports facility companies and Kosmont companies, we could work on these deals, for maybe the rest of our lifetime because they're going to take a lot of time and effort and a lot of creative solutions.
Ken, it's a great point, and that's why I'm glad to be the sports person. You get to be the public community banker and put these complex capital structures together. But I think if I could distill all that down, there are no shortage of different types of programs and that are out there in different communities, different parts of the country. One of the things that does make this a little complex, a little confusing, is as you go through these different acronyms and different programs, they really do vary state by state and even county to county in some cases. And so, I do really encourage working with a professional like Cosmont, someone who knows how to navigate those public sector opportunities and programs. Incredibly impactful when you start putting that overall capital strategy together. All right, now let's talk about how we apply these different things. Let's talk about some case studies. Ken, you teed this one up earlier. I think this is a really great example of a creative use. You want to talk about City of El Centro in California?
Sure, it's in Imperial County, which is the county that's immediately adjacent to Mexico, southern part of California, if you will. There's a school district, if you will, the Imperial County Office of Education that controls land. What they have found is that many of their residents, if you will, whether it's in the city of El Centro or the county, are leaving for sports. And sports is youth sports is a big deal, right? So where are they going? They're going to Arizona, to the east. They're going to San Diego County. They're going to Orange County. They're exiting. And so, is there an opportunity to keep them in town? And that was part of our evaluation. It was, sort of a land use strategy and what else can come with it, leveraging some of the land they control, 70 acres or so. It's a financing strategy that our Cosmont Financial Services may be able to help them with on how to pay for a facility. The bright idea that came out of our evaluation was that a sports academy could be a really good catalyst to
Hmm.
unlock some of this land and then serve your community. Keep those folks in town because youth sports is so, critical and so important to that market in that region.
Absolutely. We talked about changing in retail strategy. This is a really interesting project that we opened this past year in Macon, Georgia. And if you look at the structure there, you see 32 pickleball courts over two different levels. And this is in a former mall. So this was a department retail store and over the years became less and less valuable real estate from the commercials perspective. And Macon wanted to do something about that. And so what's really interesting about this rhythm and rally, they took part of the end cap of the structure, and in the top right corner, you see a really interesting, exciting 10,000 person capacity amphitheater for live entertainment. That's the rhythm part. And then in this large box anchor retail, we now have the city doing a long-term lease and the capital improvements to build out those pickleball courts. And this is at its core truly a public-private partnership. The municipality leased the land, built out the space. They're working with a private operator on the live entertainment and the outdoor amphitheater. SFC is operating the pickleball program, and this is one where to help make the overall capital strategy work, SFC also helped to invest in the food and beverage opportunities that are on site for this program so that we could close the gap and that public sector funding. We're really proud to announce this project just won a Sports Destination Management Champions of Economic Impact Award this past year. And we're also excited to announce we're going to be working with Southern Pickleball, who, if you're a pickleballer and you're on this webinar, you've probably heard of them. They're kind of a big deal. And we're going to be working with them as their home base in this next calendar year. And we're really excited about that. Another example, while we just talk about mall redevelopment, this is a project that's currently going through its visioning process in Charleston, West Virginia. This is another exciting project in a couple fronts. It's not just redeveloping underutilized retail. This is also a mall that was uniquely built in an urban core downtown. So while we bring this retail value back up to a higher price point, what we're also doing by activating this site is we're activating downtown. There's convention space, there's hotel space, and a number of other businesses that will certainly benefit from this facility coming online.
Yeah, I'll speak to this for a minute. I already kind of went through some of it. This is in Norco in the Inland Empire, Riverside County, California. 122 acres, city controlled the land. It was deed restricted, as I mentioned earlier. But as it turned out, to satisfy a huge demand in the marketplace for really world-class soccer fields and frankly, world-class equestrian uses. And so we did the ground lease, and that's why I was saying earlier that that's an asset. The city leveraged it. Today we have some different laws that if a city controls land, just to put that out there, if a city controls property in California, they are subject to something called the Surplus Land Act. We're working through many of those circumstances. Our brokerage company, Kosmont Realty, handles a lot of surplus land act activities. But when cities have assets, it's an asset strategy. You got to figure out how to leverage it, how to solve for something, and then how to serve the community. None of this stuff is easy. There was a question, Eric, that showed up in the Q&A. I just glanced at it. Yes, these things are complicated. What is too complicated? Well, if you do nothing, I think it's the wrong strategy, right? So you got to find that happy medium between, can you get to the finish line with something? If the city sat on this land, it could have just been pure open space without it being activated for a sports driven and ecotourism driven use.
Right on. Ken, I'm glad you mentioned that. 15-minute warning. We're going to get to some questions here in a moment. We've had some great questions come into the Q&A, but if anything is coming top of mind, don't hesitate to ask. We got Ken here on the hot seat. Let's make him answer some tough ones. Bring those questions
I'm
through
ready.
as we bring
I'm
on some
ready.
other case studies here. So this is one we're really excited about. It's in construction right now. It's going to be coming online this next year. This is the Ontario Sports Empire in Southern California. It will be the largest sports complex of its kind west of the Rockies. It's over 190 acres. We'll have 8 full-size baseball diamonds, 14 youth diamonds, 20 rectangular fields for soccer, lacrosse, flag football, and more, and then 2 dedicated tackle football fields as well. We're also really excited. We will be working with the single A affiliate of the recent World Series Dodgers. So that's something that we're really excited to host on campus as well. And this is a project that was really interesting. Another program, Ken, feel free to weigh in if you've got any thoughts on this, but this was partially funded by Measure Q, which was voted on by the citizens in the city of Ontario. And that's an incremental 1% sales tax. And what that did is it generated an additional over $95 million coming into that community. And what I found interesting, I'm no expert on, Ken, I'm sure you know more, but with Measure Q, it is a local tax that can't be touched by the county, the state. It really stays local and hyper local from that standpoint. Now, all that money is not going to this project, but I thought it was really neat that those funds are all staying in the immediate community.
Yeah, dedicating funds like that, agreeing to an increase in sales tax, which is driven by the voters, if you will, increasing transient occupancy tax. Those revenue streams become critical to the general funds of cities, and they're critical to fund projects like this. Ontario has been is just a real success story in terms of who they are as a city, who they are as a community, the exciting things they have. They have an airport, they have empire, they have industrial, they have jobs, they have a great community. We've worked with them very closely on a lot of different things, including even evaluating a tax increment financing district. So they're a very out of the box thinking community, and it shows.
Absolutely. One more, and if you've been on our webinar series, probably no stranger to Advent Health Sports Park at Blue Hawk. This is a really exciting project in Overland Park, Kansas. The developer there are the Price brothers. And what's interesting about this project is that it is also funded by a sales tax program. This is called Star Bonds, and it's a sales tax rebate that can come from a specific district. And what you see here is just an incredible vision come to life. And that is over 600,000 square feet of restaurant, retail, and entertainment space. And then our first phase, over a 260,000 square foot indoor field house, that will be up over 300,000 square feet when it's fully built out. But this type of project is truly a premier offering of entertainment and sports. The private sector brought the equity in the land and the delivery of the development to the market. The Star Bond program is a state level program. And then, as I mentioned, when we think about different partners that come to the table, Advent Health has been just an incredible partner. Not only are they a naming rights partner, but they are coming in on site and helping with services in the facility and programs in the facility and activating in a number of different ways. And I think as we talk about different types of projects and as these projects continue to grow in size and scale and complexity, the exciting piece is the guest experience just keeps getting better and better. And I would say the returns from a community aspect just get better and better because we have more opportunities to play and more opportunities to recreate as a community. All right, I'm going to shift gears to the questions here, and I'll take a couple that have come in here and quarterback these, Ken, between you and me. Fred,
Yep.
you tip of the hat to you. You must know that I'm a soccer fanatic because you gave a soccer specific question, so my bias is going to default. Fred Mathis asked, in the area of urban revitalization, as Eric put it, do you see more stadiums coming in online like the European type, where football, soccer grounds are built on postage stamp size areas within a city, like a city block, that relies more on mass transit, walking, multimodal, or other large parking decks and paved lots versus acreage? It's a great question, Fred. And we actually just did a session with the United Soccer League, with USL, and we talked specifically with a couple interesting groups. One just had their first successful year last year as league champions, the Rhode Island FC. And Tidewater Landing is a really exciting example of a challenging project right on a riverfront in an urban setting, but that's been hugely successful and impactful and revitalizing and bringing more people and concentration to that area. Colorado Springs, similar setting that is part of a redevelopment effort. And likewise in the MLS in Philadelphia, you saw a large waterfront space dedicated to Subaru Park and the development there that is now home to a youth academy and more opportunities for people to come in and to play right there downtown. And then last but not least, I'll say this. I think, even right here in our backyard in St. Petersburg, Florida, the Rowdies are a good example of this, where they have a great impact on the community because before the games, there's some tailgating, but it really happens in the bars, in the restaurants, in the downtown, and creates this procession to the stadium, which is just a really exciting game day atmosphere and really fun for all to take part. Ken, I'm going to kick this next one over to you. You touched on it briefly, but I do think it's worth spending a little bit of time on. And that is, you mentioned John Mead asked, I'm wondering about the diminishing returns of potentially overly complex P3 approaches. Is it a house of cards if the project is too dependent on too many factors? Partners bring strength and resiliency and community support, but how much is too much? What are your thoughts on that? Where do we see that tipping point of diminishing return with public-private partnerships?
Yeah, it's really a good question. I tried to allude to it a little bit earlier. I appreciate the question. How complex is too complex? At the end of the day, I think developing and redeveloping and in places like California, as an example, it's a complicated concept. Bringing a new large scale sports facility to a greenfield somewhere maybe is a little bit easier, but they all have their complexities to it because the funding sources have to be appropriate. You can't, it's not a singular funding source typically, right? You can't just have the developer fund these things. So I really think that we're in a very out of the box mode right now for capitalization and public-private partnerships and economic development, which is, I think, why at least companies like ours, we really try to bring expertise. I think we try to bring a simplification to things because we have to make presentations to city council members. We have to go in front of the community. We have to explain these complicated structures and deals. And if we're not able to do that, then we're not really doing our job very well. So you can put the burden on the resources that are available, whether it's Eric's group, our group, both of us. If we come to the table, we can more quickly understand, does something make sense? Because the other part of our analysis is, does something make sense? Should we do a district?
Mm.
Should we go sell the land? Should we ground lease land? Should we do a bond? How can this thing come to fruition? Is the gap too big? I mean, fair enough. Does this deal pencil or not? And I think that if we end up in the business of being very honest, which we are, we can figure out quickly whether something can make some sense or not. It's going to take time either way. But if we can at least help mitigate the risk and then quantify the opportunity in terms of how long it might take and what its probability is, and is the gap too big or is it something that can be closed? That's the things that we get very involved with. So I'm not
Ken,
sure if that
that's a
answers the
great.
question. We're willing to answer questions after the webinars like this. We're obviously very, very available.
Absolutely. And Ken, that's a great point. I think in response to John's question, the only thing that I would layer in there is it's got to work with the overall timeline. And sometimes when you start thinking about all the municipal programs that are out there, when you start layering in some different state programs that may be out there, grant timelines that might be out there, sometimes the timelines don't add up. And if all of a sudden you're seeing the project is being held up because you're waiting for more opportunities, I think keeping in mind there's probably an ideal timeline from a design and construction standpoint that you want to open in, specifically on the sports entertainment side. And if you can't make that timeline, that's when I would start thinking about sometimes, too much might be too much. But if you can make it work, I think what I would leave the crowd with is, at the end of the day, a public-private partnership should really be a triple win. The public sector should win because they should get a better project delivered more efficiently than they can do on their own. The private sector should win because they should get better cost of capital. They should get more efficient and bigger, better projects. And ultimately, if the public and the private sector win from the development standpoint, the community is going to win because they're going to have a better project at the end of the day. Ken,
Hey,
I'll
Eric,
let
there
you
was a
wrap us
third.
up. Any words of
Yeah,
wisdom
no,
you'd like to bring us home with?
thank you so much. Appreciate that. I totally agree with you about win-win circumstances. There was a third question that I kind of answered. I texted back, and it was from Terrence Grindle, who is in Newark, California. Well, the irony of it is in about 3 minutes, I'm leaving my home office and I'm getting on an airplane and I'm flying up to the Team California conference to an event called Meet the Consultants. And I'm going to make a presentation because I can't help myself but to talk about economic development and real estate and public private. And I'm going to be there tonight and tomorrow. And I have even a more robust presentation that discusses, land economic development, land use trends and tools. The question on the mall, right? Kosmont, me personally, I'm in a dozen mall projects in Newark, California. I would love to have the discussion about what do we do with the mall. And it does have to start at some level with who owns it? How many parties own it? Are there CC&Rs? How can that property be unlocked, improved, reimagined, revitalized? And then what can the city do to help? And again, as Eric mentioned, and I'll close with, both the public and private sectors need to be in the room. So I actually provided the councilman from Newark, California, my contact info. But we are available. Kosmont, myself, Ken, Hira, obviously Eric. We're very available and we're working very collaboratively just to kind of close out together on a lot of different things. So we would love to kind of help any community or any opportunity, come to fruition.
Ken, I can't thank you enough for joining us today, for sharing knowledge. It's truly always a pleasure. You're an expert in your craft, and we're so grateful for having you. Several of you have asked about the presentation. We'll make sure to make the PowerPoint available. Reach out to us at the emails there on the Q&A slide or in the chat to Elize, and we will make sure to get that over to you. Thank you, and we'll see you on the next webinar series.